So let's get started talking about the specific techniques and tools that you'll need to piece the Friends All Around block.
It's a straightforward block. There's just one block that you're going to be repeating throughout over and over to make this quilt. And you'll be able to use different colors and values to have different layouts, but they're all made the same way. So the first thing to talk about is the templates. Some of you may be using the acrylic templates that we have called the Good Measure Modern Circle Set. If you have these, great. They're nice, heavy, non-slip templates. You can use those.
You'll need just from that set. There are extra templates in that set. You won't need them all, but you will use A, F, E, and D for this particular project.
Exactly. And those templates and the print, if you do the download, they all include the 1/4-inch seam allowance already. So you're going to cut exactly to the edge of the templates. Now, many of you may have purchased the pattern as a download, in which case you printed out a sheet that, depending on which one you have, it may have a 1-inch test square or it may have a 4-inch test strip. But whenever you print out a template, whether it's this pattern or any other, if there's a test square, it's always very, very important to check and make sure if it says it's 1 inch, measure, it should be 1 inch in both directions. If it isn't, there's probably a little checkbox in your printer dialog box that says fit to page or scale, and you will have to make an adjustment. The goal is to print it 100% because the actual pattern is perfectly sized for that to be 1 inch.
And you're sure, Bill?
People are always saying
it isn't our file.
No, our file is perfect.
Printer.
It is perfect to the 1,000th of an inch. So
we promise you it's accurate.
Yeah. So every printer is a little different. Just make sure yours is right. And some of you will be working with the pattern from our calendar. And there was a note, and I just want to make sure that you see that there was an error when they printed it, and some of the templates weren't scaled correctly. If you have the calendar, make sure you go to the Quiltalong page. There's a link there that takes you to a simple printout that's absolutely accurate. And that's also on our website under the errata or corrections. So just make sure, whatever you do, that you have the correct template. Now, if you're cutting these out, you can trace them, to template plastic. Doesn't matter if it's gridded template plastic or if it's clear template plastic, but you can just trace that and cut each of these individually.
Sharpie works great for that.
Sharpie's awesome.
New to tracing on template plastic.
And then, if you don't have template plastic, you could use a cardboard box. Mm-hmm. You can use a cereal box and cut that out. But if you do use a lighter weight template plastic or cardstock, one thing we recommend is to take some office tape, and once you've cut out your template, just take a little loop of office tape and put it on the back, or if you have double-faced tape, that's great. And we just put that on the back of the template just to help prevent slipping as you cut. Now, those templates will be really easy. You're going to line them up. I'm going to use, our Good Measure acrylic templates because they're beefy and easy to see. When you cut, we recommend keeping these straight lines lined up with the grain of your fabric. That way, all of your fabrics will have the grain in the same direction. Very straightforward. We also recommend, if you like it, to use a smaller diameter rotary cutter. These are a little smoother when you're cutting curves, but if you just have a standard 45mm rotary cutter, that works well too. You just have to be a little slower at times.
You're going to need some pins. We really recommend that you pin. Even if you're a person who doesn't normally pin, we know that there are people who have made this quilt without pinning, but it's a lot more fun when it goes together smoothly. And because the smallest piece is a slightly smaller radius, it is a lot easier to manage the whole quilt if you use pins the way we recommend in the pattern. So, but before we get into that, let's talk about the sequence of the sewing and how you're going to pin, and let's just kind of break down an
overview.
Yeah, the block. So the block is 4 pieces that we saw with the templates that we showed you. And the pinning sequence and the sewing sequence, we have determined to give you the maximum amount of stabilization, because you've got a lot of pieces that are all cut on the bias and you don't want them to stretch too much. So we recommend that you sew this seam, this middle seam, between the 2 arcs first. Then when this piece is sewn, sew it to the smaller piece, and then sew the bigger piece at the end.
So you're making that quarter circle first, starting with the largest arc, and then that will be so much more stable to put in the corner.
Right. If you feel strongly that you want to do it differently, that's totally fine. But the reason that our goal is to get the biggest seams that need to go together stable first. These corner pieces are already pretty stable because they're cut on the grain on at least 2 sides of it. But those middle strips are the same thing with the smaller piece. They're anchored by the grain, but these kind of floppy bits we're a little worried about. So we want to get them sewn together as quickly as possible. You know, I warn you, if you haven't pieced curves before, it looks very awkward. If you're accustomed to sewing straight seams where everything lies flat.
Oh, this is weird.
It's counterintuitive, and it takes a little bit getting used to, but we promise it will work.
And I'll be showing you at the machine in a moment.
Yeah.
So this is showing you the structure and the order, and then in a moment you'll join me at the machine while I actually sew these.
But I will show you how to pin to get it over to the machine. So as you can see, they're not going to lie flat totally once they're pinned, but you can just still put them in piles or nestle them if you're trying to do several blocks at once. I do recommend, if at all possible, trying to pin the pieces together, because if you're making this as a scrappy quilt, you're going to be kind of auditioning 4 pieces at one time based on either your palette or your plan to have maybe the corner piece is dark or the corner piece is light or whatever, and that anchoring, you know, having all of them sorted out and kind of let them travel together.
Yeah, like in this case, Weeks had already picked, she wanted a block that, I'm just going to set this aside for a moment. She wanted a block when finished that would look like this. She auditioned it, looked great. Once she was happy with it, she took it all together and pinned it. And that makes it easier to take over.
I kind of like to pin before I go to the machine.
Yeah.
Do you pin when you get to the machine?
I do it often, pinning at the machine.
I kind of like to bulk pin.
It's like, this is another thing, whatever works for you.
Yeah. So, but let's go through how you're going to piece that first arc, because the same process will apply to all of the other arcs.
Right. So
you want to get started on these 2?
These are going to get joined like that, but just like all quilting, you have to pin the right sides together. And you'll see, like, wait a minute, they're curving in opposite directions. This is what's unusual.
Before you get going, can I point out one thing? This looks so wrong. This looks like they're not going to fit because of the seam allowance. And it's really different when you're dealing with squares. They're all the same.
So true.
The rectangles, they're all the same. Because it looks like you've cut incorrectly. It's going to look like the templates are wrong. But if you were to overlay them,
you can actually see
you can see that they will line up perfectly.
There's going to be a quarter of an inch. If you put the seam in the middle, there'll actually be a 1/2 inch overlap.
But it's going to look wrong when you cut it.
Perfectly.
Yeah, it's going to look wrong when you cut it.
So the goal is, like, how do you get these to fit perfectly? So our trick is always to fold it in half and get a very sharp crease. Fold it in half, get a sharp crease that you'll be able to see. If you want to chalk the crease to mark it, you can. We usually don't.
You can like hit it with a little iron too.
But then
this is what it looks like.
We fold right sides together. And look at this. This is so important. The creases are perfectly lined up and are touching right at their common edge. And I'm going to put my pin in 1/4 of an inch from that edge. I'm going to put it in and stabilize it.
Some people I know like to fold these in the same direction so they nest, the creases nest in one another.
That's actually a good idea.
That's extra credit
if
you want to do it that way.
And then this is the next strange thing. I'm going to pull these around and get the edges perfectly lined up and get the corner perfectly lined up.
It's that 90-degree angle that you're lining up. You're not lining up the edge of the curve.
Right.
Because that also is kind of a little mind-bendy sort
of thing.
And
I'm putting my pin in 1/4 of an inch from the edge. Now I'm doing the exact same thing here. This is coming out to join. So these are nice and flush. I'm going to put a pin in right here and stabilize that. So I pinned the center, then the 2 corners, and this is going to look strange. In order to go forward, we need to pin one more time in between. And so I bring my pins together and I can squeeze here. And what I'm going to get by squeezing is it's going to mark the center between those 2 pins. And I am going to get those 2 kind of creases to nest. And I don't know, this is a little hard to see.
Yeah,
from overhead, you should be able to see that. When I get it, so they're lined up at the edge, I put my pin 1/4 of an inch in from the edge and pin. And I do this again on the other side.
So the goal of this is that you're trying to ease, if you've done garment sewing, it's just like a sleeve. But if you're new to curves, what you're trying to do is spread out the bulk of the seam allowance so you don't get tucks when you get to the machine.
And what you'll have is, you'll notice that this smaller piece is pretty flat. The bigger piece has a ton of kind of puckering going on because it's larger. There's extra fabric.
But
now,
all that matters is what's going to happen 1/4 of an inch from this raw edge. So the goal of this careful pinning is to make sure that this area, 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge, is going to remain flat and that you're not going to get tucks and puckering once you've actually sewn that seam.
So at a minimum, we recommend having these 5 pins. A lot of people will add extra pins in between just to help stabilize it. Totally up to you how you do it. Once again, it's ideal to pin 1/4 of an inch in because that's where you're...
We've got some bent up pins.
Oh, that's a very bent pin. So you can add pins as necessary. But again, what I want you to see is one piece is naturally very flat and then the other has excess. That's very important because when you join me at the machine, I'll always make sure to have that flat piece flat on the sewing table.
The other thing that you're going to notice is that the difference between how awkward that little curve is. It's a lot harder to get it to lie flat with this smaller curve than it is with the biggest curve. But this is still a manageable, you can see how we've pinned it. And this is still a very manageable, because you're focusing on just that 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge. You're not worried about what's happening in the rest of the piece.
So once again, this first step out shows you what I've done here with lots of pins though.
Yeah.
This one shows how you take the joined curve, which we've already pressed the seam, and pinned in the smallest piece. This last example shows you what it looks like when you have the quarter circle that's all finished. You can see it's all pinned or pressed open, and we've pinned it to the corner. Now the corner is also going to look really weird. Yeah. Like all the shapes deform when you put the right sides together because your curves seem like they're fighting one another. But you'll see as soon as it's pieced, it presses very nicely.
It's like magic once you actually finish that seam and you open it up and it's totally flat suddenly. But you have to get through each of those seams. You know, I also recommend pressing after each seam because when you are working then to pin the next seam, if the first seam isn't flat, you lose your way and it just becomes harder to maintain. So after each seam, we recommend pressing. You can press whatever your personal preference is. All of ours are pressed open. You don't have to. We use steam, no starch. Do whatever works for you. But you want the pieces as flat as you can between seams because it's easier given all of this non-flat pinning that happens here.
And the thing is, it looks awkward at first, but once you get into the kind of
after the first couple,
it just becomes really routine.
Yeah.
And we often work on 2 or 4 blocks at a time so we can chain piece, get up, do a quick press, chain piece. If you were doing 1 block at a time and you sewed, pressed, it'd be a lot of jack in the box, up and down.
Yeah.
So you might do your first block, just 1 block, but then you can start chain piecing as you feel comfortable.
Now, I would also suggest if you're new to curves and you're nervous about it, if you have some fabric that is either faded or damaged or you don't even like, do your first block with scraps because that will give you, it will just feel less stressful.
And speaking of less stress, take your time cutting, take your time pinning, take your time piecing. It will go together much more smoothly if you just take your time with each step. So why don't you join me over at the sewing machine? I will sew this curve and one other example together so you can see how they go together.
Actually, let's sew all 3 so they can see the different radii and how they perform sort of under the needle.
Terrific. See you over at the machine. I've got our machine all set up with a medium gray thread that will be perfect for the variety of fabrics we're sewing. I've also put a new full bobbin in just to make sure I don't run out partway through. I'm going to start showing how to piece this first curve, which is the 2 arcs that we pinned at the other table. Now, you'll notice one side has a smaller curve that naturally lies flat, and the larger curve has excess. So I'm going to make a real point of having that smaller flat curve on the table. That's really crucial. I'm using a 1/4 inch foot. You can use whatever you want. I'm going to put this in, line up really carefully, and I'm going to start sewing slowly here. And I'm going to pull out the pin right as I get to it, and I'm going to slowly ease through, pulling out each pin as I get to it. And I'll put those pins right there. And don't pull them out too early. If you have a machine with a needle down, you can do that to anchor. And you'll notice there's some excess fabric on the left of the needle. That doesn't matter because all that matters is that everything stays flat to the right of the seam. And at any point, if you feel like something's a little awkward, you can put your needle down and lift your presser foot and ease things out. But most of the time you won't need to do that. You'll just sew, needle down, take your pin out, and don't go too quickly. Take your time though. And I'm going to go around. Once again, if I have any issue, I can put my needle down and lift the presser foot, but I don't think I'll need to do that at all. Just showed it as an example. One of the really important things is that you keep that final pin near your edge in all the way to the last moment, because that's where a lot of the slipping can happen. And I use a little starter piece, like a lot of quilters do, in between blocks to keep the thread from coming up. I'm going to feed that back in and cut this out. And what you'll see when you open it up, the edges are wonderfully aligned. And all you have to do is flip it over, take it, and press your seam. Once you have that prepared, I'm going to move to the sample that Weeks has all prepared. These two arcs are already nicely prepared and sewn, and she pinned the small quarter circle into that. Now, once again, you'll notice that the quarter circle, that smaller piece, naturally lies flat, and there's a lot of excess here. So we're going to keep that flat piece on the table. I'm going to line up those edges, and I'm going to feed this in after my starter piece. And this is the smallest of all of the curves, so you have to take the most time with this. But as I go through, again, pull out the pin right as I get up to it, and I'm going to go again, carefully, carefully, carefully. And this is so nice. She pinned it so perfectly that it makes the sewing very smooth. And that's why we encourage you to take your time pinning. And it will go all the way through. And you can just chain piece if you want. I'm cutting each one individually just because I want to show you as soon as it's done. But ordinarily I would just piece one block after the other. And you'll see that this also will open beautifully. Once you have that pressed open, you'll pin it into the corner. In our case, we were using these slightly darker corners. Again, I'm going to start with the edges very nicely aligned. I'm going to feed that in, and I'll just go through this one really quickly. This curve is the largest, so it's the easiest. The larger the curve, the more ease it has with the bias. It's a lot more stretchy and more forgiving. But you notice as I go, I'm just making sure my right edges are nicely aligned. And again, all this excess, don't worry about it. It's going to be to the left of your seam. Feed that back in. And this is going to open and be really perfect. Look how straight these edges are. Now, if your edges aren't perfectly crisp at first, you'll see in the directions that you can line up this corner, and the block is 7.5 inches in theory. If it's a little wonky here, you can always trim it to 7.25 by 7.25. Our feeling is it's so much easier just to pin and sew so it's pretty straight. If it's a tiny bit off, that'll be hidden in the seam allowance. I prefer not trimming when possible because I think just it's one more step. but I think you'll find that after a block or two, they go together very smoothly.